Welcome to China Institute's Pieces of China, an online series that tells the story of China one object at a time. I'm Dinda Elliott, and I'm delighted to be joined today by our friend Lucas Sin, who is the culinary genius behind Junzi Kitchen, a fast casual restaurant chain. So Lucas, you've chosen to talk about the Chinese claypot, which is believed to be the oldest earthen cooking vessel in the world. Let's start with some of the basics for those who might not know. Tell us about the clay pot and what do you cook in it?
Perhaps we should start by me showing you the clay pot, right?
Perfect.
Here is the clay pot. Actually, I have two. Here's the bigger one. Here's the sort of like standard size. It's unglazed on the outside. It's usually got one handle. That's the type I prefer. And then the lid sort of looks like this. This is the whole setup. I mean, it looks ancient, right? It looks old. That's kind of like part of the, and it is a very old cooking vessel. I would say that almost everything that's ever been cooked has been cooked in one of these. We're looking at something like, some people say 20,000 years old of clay cooking. This vessel in particular, at least 2,000. So the most important thing that is cooked in this vessel, this clay pot, however, is obviously clay pot rice. And it's a dish that means a lot to me as a chef, but also my upbringing in Hong Kong.
So why did you choose this object? Tell us a little bit about why, what the clay pot means to you.
Yeah, so I opened my first restaurant in Hong Kong when I was 16. The first dish I ever learned how to cook.
How did that happen? Hang on.
It was in an abandoned newspaper factory. It was in Taiwan, which is sort of the eastern side of Hong Kong Island. And while we were in secondary school, we spent the summer figuring out how to play restaurant, basically. And that meant sort of like figuring out how to cook food and serve it to people and get people to the location and process reservations and all that sort of thing. But it also, a lot of it was about telling stories through food. And sort of that first project really got me thinking about what it means to cook food that can tell stories, that has culture behind it, that have narrative behind it, and it's not just deliciousness. And so when I opened this restaurant, the first signature dish was clay pot rice, because that's the first dish that I ever learned how to cook from my father. My father's the best chef in the world.
And what was the name of it? What was the name of it?
It was called bo zai, which is Cantonese for clay pot. That's what we call this clay pot. In Chinese, people usually refer to this as the Shāguō. But in Hong Kong, we refer to it as bo zai, which is just literally a small pot. Sometimes we call it ngā bo, which refers to the fact that it's made out of clay. So and the first signature dish was clay pot rice with taro and pork belly and a variety of cured Chinese meats, duck liver sausage, that sort of thing. And I also would refer to myself as the bo zai, I thought, because I know you had Bohan here last week. Rappers have rapper names, and then chefs sometimes have chef names. And when I was 16, I called myself bo zai, the clay pot.
Okay, and you learned to cook originally with your dad, right?
Yeah, my dad, I think, is the best chef in the world. He has this ability to make something incredible out of nothing. But he also is, especially as of recent years, really sort of dedicated to understanding a lot of the craft of Cantonese home cooking. I think for a lot of us who grew up with our parents making Chinese food, there are a lot of techniques and little tips and tricks and things involved, but my dad has gotten to really sort of investigating the validity of a lot of these techniques and perfecting the ones that matter. And that's why I love the clay pot so much. That's why I love the clay pot rice. With clay pot rice, it's a very, very humble dish. At the end of the day, all you're doing is really cooking rice with usually meat on top of it. And it couldn't be simpler, but there's so much technique involved. I mean, if you want to dive into the science of this a little bit, the clay pot is amazing for rice because it's basically semi-perforated. This clay does an amazing job of letting things breathe, as well as soaking up some of the moisture and then releasing it later. So when you're cooking this clay pot traditionally over coal, you'll have this sort of smoky perfume, as well as just the heat, just pushing all this heat through the clay pot into the rice. what ends up happening is the rice gets a toasty sort of earthy flavor that it's impossible to find any other way. You can't get it you can't get it from liquid smoke. You can't get it from a rice cooker. And so you have this like toasty rice that also, because it's breathing, the oil that sort of drips down from the meat into the rice and the sauces and things get absorbed into the pot a little bit and get released later, so that the whole thing is sort of perfumed by everything that's being cooked inside. Most of the cooking process for this clay pot, if done correctly, this lid never leaves it until the rice and everything inside is cooked. So for that reason, you have to learn how to cook clay pot rice by hearing the rice sort of crackle. You have to smell the toastiness to know that it's not burnt. You have to recognize the difference between water vapor and smoke from carbon from burning rice. It's a very sort of like involved sort of a cooking technique where you're cooking this over fire, slowly moving it around and whatnot. And back to my father, he was very clear to show me that even though this is the first that you're ever going to learn as a kid, you need to pay attention to every single detail. You have to pay attention to every single step because all of it matters, and you have to really fully engage yourself with the food when you're making the food. And I think that's sort of a lesson that is certainly carried with me as a professional chef today.
Is there a certain ritual involved in the clay pot as well when you first get it?
Yes, there is. I'm glad you asked. So clay pots are, because of that perforatedness of it, sometimes they tend to crack in the beginning. So the way to really take care of it is to soak it in water is the first step. Actually, there are a lot of myths about this, right? Here's the tiny clay pot that I have. Actually, this one is new and I haven't cooked in this yet. So it is actually just sort of like soaking in water. I don't want to tip it all over my laptop.
Beautiful.
But it's a beautiful little pot. This outside tends to crack when it's heated too quickly and then cools down too quickly. So the first thing you got to do when you're getting clay or get a new clay pot is you have to soak it in water overnight. Some people say you have to soak it in rice water, in potato water, in starch water. It doesn't really matter, but what's happening there with the potato and the starch is that it's binding some of those holes to keep the structural integrity of the pot. Now, the favorite sort of tradition around new clay pots is, in my opinion, is that the first thing you have to cook in here is congee. It's the same science as soaking it in starch water or rice water. You're boiling congee, you're heating the pot up so that some of those starches can fill in some of those holes inside of the clay pot and prevent it from cracking when it cools down too much. But the great thing about clay pots and some of my other favorite cooking tools like cast iron or like iron woks and things is that they can just get better the more you use them. They get seasoned, they develop more flavors and that sort of thing. And certainly is the same for the clay pot. So you can tell the sort of difference in the color between a new one that's sort of nice and white that I haven't used and an older one that I've used a lot that now is a lot more toastier. I would also say that I use this clay pot when I cook live fire in the woods. Well, that's one of my favorite ways to cook is out in the middle of the forest with actual fire and wood and coal. And this clay pot was the clay pot that I brought with me to cook clay pot rice over coals, which is a very difficult thing to do, but certainly worth it.
So is clay pot rice kind of your ultimate comfort food?
Absolutely. Absolutely, clay pot. It's probably my favorite food in the world. My dad still makes it better than I do. I don't know why. But there is such a ritual and it's so involved, that cooking process, that it's not, to me, like a weekday meal. It certainly is the case. It certainly is an easy, quick meal that people like to eat, especially in the winter in Hong Kong, frequently. But for me, it's just, you can't really get clay pot rice the way it is in Hong Kong here in New York. And so if I wanted to have that experience, I have to do it myself. And you know, I get nervous about it. I know how complicated. I know how much care went into cooking clay pot rice when my dad did it. So you
have to respect the clay pot rice.
You have to respect the process, right? You have to find the right type of meat. You have to find the type of rice. Everything has to be soaked well. And still to this day, I screw it up once in a while. So it is a ritual, and I wish it was more of my everyday. But I like the idea of really preparing yourself and getting yourself psyched up just to cook rice.
Yeah. So let's talk about Hong Kong. Is it still super popular in Hong Kong? Even though, Hong Kong cuisine is so sophisticated and there's so much, there's every kind of fabulous cuisine in Hong Kong, and the Chinese food, Cantonese food in Hong Kong has been elevated to a very, very high level. So talk about clay pot rice and its role in Hong Kong today.
Yeah, I mean, so as I said, the clay pot is used to cook a myriad of things, and the cool thing about the clay pot is because of how great of a vessel it is. It exists both in sort of like more expensive restaurants, sort of imperial Cantonese banquet kind of ideas, as well as in sort of more humble, so to speak, like clay pot rice type of places. Clay pot rice certainly is as popular as it is ever because it is insanely delicious, and it is really, really special to have a cook make an individual pot of rice where the meat or the fish or whatever that's steamed on top of the rice is just for you, and it's all encapsulated. It's in one little package. There's one restaurant in Shāguō called funkier that is perhaps still to this day one of the most popular restaurants in Hong Kong. Celebrities line up for it, and I look forward to going back there. They have an amazing black bean marinated freshwater eel clay pot rice that is absolutely unparalleled. But on the sort of more sophisticated side of things too, you will hear chefs talk about cooking with clay pots, and clay pots are really well insulated, right? They keep their heat in very well. So if you, let's say, were to make a stir fry and you were to add it to a hot pot, that ingredient would continue to cook inside of that clay pot. So you hear stories about chefs knowing how far away their customers are, like which table they're sitting at, and therefore timing how hot to get the food or how much to cook it so that the heat of the clay pot will take it the rest of the way so that when they open it, it's perfect. That amount of sophistication absolutely exists, and we're talking about sort of the most famous sort of like celebrity chefs in Hong Kong using clay pots like that, right?
Wow. And then you talked about other places where there will be pots stacked up, and yet and yet the chef is somehow able to keep track.
Right. Yeah, these tiny little clay pots, right? They're probably about this size. They probably hold about 2 cups of rice maybe, and you can imagine that. I mean, we talked about how laborious the clay pot rice process is, but these chefs are able to juggle sort of 20 stacks of these rice with rice pre-soaked inside, and they're still cooking them individually. A lot of the time they'll have a towel like this, and this towel would be sort of wrapped around the clay pot. I'm just going to show you that real quick like this. Like it would be wrapped around like this with a little bit of a knot to keep the sort of steam inside. And so there's no way of looking at the rice itself, but they're cooking 20 of them at a time. All of them are individualized. You might have chicken, mine might have pork, somebody else has sausage with no spicy in it. So they're managing all of these things at once. And the food still comes out to you relatively quickly. You usually sit down in a clay pot restaurant, and the waiters will apologize that you have to wait for the food. That's like 10 or 15 minutes instead of 5 minutes. But that wait is absolutely worth it. And still, I think the amount of culinary prowess involved in clay pot rice cookery is absolutely amazing.
Right. And talk a little bit about how you've seen the culinary scene change in Hong Kong over the decades.
Yeah, the Hong Kong culinary sort of like restaurant landscape is a really pretty complicated one. There's a lot of, you can't talk about the Hong Kong restaurant scene without thinking about gentrification, without thinking about sort of like economic inequality and the different sort of like types of people that are within Hong Kong and the Hong Kong people. The Hong Kong culinary landscape and the restaurant landscape certainly has evolved a lot, and there's a lot of worry about these mom and pop old school traditional shops having a difficult time in the modern day for every reason possible. But I would like to believe that we as chefs who are from Hong Kong have a little bit of a responsibility to keep telling these sort of traditional stories about traditional cookware and techniques, and also to spread it with us as the diaspora sort of expands. I'm interested to see how clay pot cooking will function, honestly, in New York when we're making Cantonese food, but also in New York when we're making Italian food. Maybe there's something interesting to be done with these clay pots. I was talking with an incredible chef, Pierre Thiam, who is a Senegalese West African chef who came to Brooklyn, and he ran some of the most famous sort of hotels in Senegal. He's an amazing chef, but before he could get the right type of cookware and the right type of ingredients, he would turn to Chinatown and find these clay pots, and these clay pots would stand in for his West African cooking. There is a sort of like a commonality and globalness to this sort of like a clay pot cooking that I think would be amazing to continue to explore.
Wow. So Lucas, these are really crazy times, and we're all looking for comfort. So if clay pot rice is your comfort food, when's the next time you're going to make it?
I haven't thought about. It's too hot to make clay pot rice.
Ah,
It should be a winter. It should be a winter
okay.
dish. But now that I've been thinking about it, last time I made. I'll tell you the last time I made clay pot rice was because a friend of mine dropped off a nice chunk of Iberico ham that they had brought back from Spain, and when there's nice smoked meat, you always want to put it on top of rice in a clay pot. So that was the last time I made it, and that was maybe 2 months ago. And I'm excited to do it again, just whenever it stops being so darn hot
It's
outside.
getting chilly. Right, right, right. Well, Lucas, thank you so much for turning cooking into such a global conversation, truly. And I'm sorry we have to stop here, but we promise to try to bring Lucas back in longer form when hopefully he can do not only talking, but maybe even do some cooking at China Institute.
With the clay pot.
This with the clay pot, absolutely. So this will be uploaded to YouTube, so you can see it again, and along with the rest of our Pieces of China episodes. I want to encourage you all to please become members of China Institute. It's not expensive, and you get great discounts on everything we do. But more importantly, that kind of support really helps us bring brilliant speakers like Lucas Sin to you in our broad array of programs. Please join us next week for an expert on Chinese youth, Zach Deichtwald, who's going to talk about a super hot rock song that's a window on what young people in China are thinking about today. So Lucas, I want to thank you so much again. I also want to give you a little plug that Junzi has started a distance dining initiative every Friday. It's a 3-course meal delivered to your home. And tomorrow's is the 5 elements of the Chinese pantry, which Lucas has told me are oil, salt, soy, vinegar, and tea. So tune in to those distance dining events. If you can't get it, if there aren't any available for tomorrow, they do it every Friday. Lucas, I want to thank you so much again for helping tell the story of China. See you soon.
Wonderful. I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.